The Federal Housing Administration would only provide these loan guarantees to developers who agreed to not build their development anywhere near where African Americans lived, and then to put restrictive covenants on the deeds of the homes that they built, saying that the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. And those homes, like you said, they were affordable because they were subsidized by the federal government. They cost about, in Levittown in New York, about $100,000 in today's money. And those homes accumulated in value. Now in Levittown, the median home price is over $600,000. That's how, even when the policies that established segregation have changed, the consequences they compound over time. So the wealth gap between blacks and whites has been huge and getting bigger since the passage of the Fair Housing Act.
Today's guest is Leah Rothstein. She is the co-author of Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation, enacted under the color of law, that describes how local community groups can redress the wrongs of segregation. She also writes a regular column to which you can subscribe for free at justaction.substack.com. How's it going, Leah?
It's going well. How are you?
I'm doing good. Why don't you go ahead and start with just a quick summary of the book, and why don't you let us know when it's going to release in the paperback?
Sure. Okay, so to summarize Just Action, I have to go back a little bit. And I'll start with the idea we have in this country to explain why we have racially segregated communities. So we have adopted an explanation for the racial segregation of our cities as attributing it to what's called de facto segregation, which means it wasn't caused by laws or policies, but caused by private actors or personal preferences, or just kind of happened by accident. And in 2017, my father, Richard Rothstein, released The Color of Law, which takes on that de facto segregation idea and basically debunks it, shows with detail after detail after detail from history of how government policy explicitly and intentionally created racially segregated communities. Now, in that book, he argued, and he showed, with all of this primary research from history, all of the government policies from local, state, and federal government that created and maintained segregation. And, those policies were in violation of the Constitution, of the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. And so his sort of call to action in The Color of Law was, once we reckon with the fact that our government violated its own Constitution to create segregation, we can realize that we have an obligation to do something about it, to reverse those policies and then remedy their impacts. Because that's what we do when our government, breaks its own laws. We have an obligation to fix it. And so, a lot of people read The Color of Law. It sold over 1 million copies. It's been very widely read, and people have been very moved to sort of rediscover the true history of how we came to be segregated. And they hear that call to action, the obligation to remedy it, but they don't know what to do and how to live up to that obligation. And, a lot of people who read The Color of Law and listened to my dad talk about it asked him, after listening to him talk, I was one of those people, it's really important that we now know this history, but what can we do today? It feels sort of impossible to make any change on these issues today. How can we live up to this obligation? And so my dad and I got together to write Just Action, which answers that question. What can we do today in our own communities to challenge segregation, remedy its ongoing impacts? And we outline dozens of policies and strategies and programs that local groups can undertake in their own communities. We focus very intentionally on the local level that can have a big impact towards challenging segregation. And then we give stories from around the country of communities that have successfully implemented those ideas. We hope to inspire people to action and also show that there's so much we can do. This idea that we are powerless in the face of segregation is not really true.
What I really like about that book is that I have people that come into my chat and we discuss some things that are very pertinent to today's situation in politics. And almost always what I get is, I hear what you're saying, but what are we supposed to do about it? And I think that, your father's book is well read. I've seen so many references to your father's book since, getting the invitation to interview you, that it really brought to light something that I was unaware of. And that is that I had a very glaring hole in my education when it came to what exactly has caused specifically the segregation, but the wealth gap between African Americans and white families. There's a funny statistic. It's something like, well, I guess funny isn't a word for it, a crazy statistic that says it's like the 400 richest Americans in America have more wealth than all 10 million African Americans combined. And there's when you say something like that, it brings up the subject and people hear that and they go, wow, that's crazy. But then the follow-up question is, well, what do you do about that? And we've entered more and more into a polarized political atmosphere where you have people that don't want those questions to even be asked because it brings hard truths to light that have to be answered. And if these truths don't get answered, then they fester and they become a real issue, whether or not we want to recognize it or not. Can you explain to me what residential segregation is and how it impacts the lives of everyday Americans?
Sure. Residential segregation is what we all see in our communities. Every metropolitan area around the country, in all regions of the country, is pretty racially segregated, where especially the segregation of blacks and whites. So this means that some neighborhoods are mostly or all white and other neighborhoods are mostly or all African American. And that separation of races into different neighborhoods is not a benign separation of people where the neighborhoods are sort of equally resourced and they just contain people of different races. The same policies that created racial segregation ensured that white neighborhoods were better resourced than African American neighborhoods. They have more bank branches, more grocery stores selling healthy food. They're less likely to be anywhere near industrial land uses and factories that spew pollution in the air. They're less likely to be near freeways. They have newer homes or better maintained homes that don't have lead paint in them. They're, parks. They have parks and open space, and they're less likely to be built on sites that were previously industrial land uses, so the soil is contaminated. They have more access to jobs and transportation to get to those jobs. Whereas in segregated African American neighborhoods, you have the opposite: fewer bank branches, fewer grocery stores selling healthy food, more polluted air, more lead paint in the buildings, fewer parks and open space, less access to hospitals and healthcare, less well-resourced public schools. So it's not just a separation of people, it's a separation of resources. And this separation has huge impacts on the quality of our lives, our life outcomes. I don't know if you've heard the phrase zip code matters or place matters. That refers to it really matters where you grow up to determine your life outcomes. And you can track by zip code, how segregated a neighborhood is. Really impacts how those children will, enjoy their lives. So, for example, children who grow up in segregated African American communities, more likely high poverty areas or lower income areas, they have higher rates of asthma because of all of the pollution in the air. They have higher rates of lead poisoning because of the paint in their buildings. They grow up to have higher rates of cancer and heart disease. And they have shorter life expectancies to the tune of like decades. And this is compared to white children who grow up in white communities in the same city. So just a couple miles apart, and those children's life outcomes and how long they live to a significant extent, like decades different, matters based on where they grew up and the conditions of those neighborhoods. And that's just sort of health outcomes. There's also differences in income outcomes and educational outcomes, mental health outcomes, access to or exposure to crime and violence and stress. Sort of it all comes down to where we live and how those neighborhoods have been created and resourced or not.
Yeah, and it's a cycle, right? I grew up myself very, very poor. I have access to many life experiences to attest to this. I can tell you that the job opportunities available specifically to the African American community, which makes up the larger portion of the impoverished community, when you live in a place like that, there's nowhere really to work. Yeah. And people completely underestimate what I say when I say I grew up poor. When I say I grew up poor, people go, "Oh yeah, my dad had two jobs, my mom had to work, we could barely pay the rent." And I go, "No, no, 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 no. My mom was disabled. My father was not in my life. We survived off about $500 a month from her Social Security and from food stamps. We lived in a incredibly poor place. I had no running water, no heat, no air conditioning. For a small amount of time, I'll spare you the details, but we did not have a bathroom and we used a 5 gallon bucket. Before I went to school in the mornings, I would take baths from water hose water and I would take cold water baths before I would go to school when I decided to go to school. And that is it's an issue in our society where when we hear the words poor, we think working poor.
Mm.
We think people that are working really hard, barely able to pay their rent, able to put food on their tables. And it's the reality of certain situations, specifically in the African American community, as I grew up with a lot of African Americans, was that it was not so much that you could barely put food on the table, it was that sometimes you didn't have food to put on the table. And that also involves your ability to work. So a person that can't eat is not ready to go to work. A person that does not eat or does not have access to meals 3 times a day is not interested in going to school. A lot of the crime rates that happen in the impoverished community are because many of the people that are living down there don't have the ability to look to the hope that people in the middle class, the lower middle class have, the hope to get out. If you are a lower middle class person, a lot of times there's still hope. There's still, you have a car, you have food on the table, you might have a roof over your head. For a small amount of time, I lived under a bridge. I lived in cars. I lived by rivers. I lived in Slab City. Do you know where Slab City is?
No.
Okay, so Slab City is down in Southern California. It's near the Salton Sea.
Mm.
It's an military establishment. I think it was an army. And it's called Slab City because it's in the middle of the desert and there's nothing but concrete slabs down there now. And it was a community for mostly people that were running from warrants, running from the police and such. And they would just stay out there. I was actually removed from the care of my mother for about a year and taken to a Los Niños because of an issue with child abuse.
Mm.
So when you think about these situations and you think about, well, most people, specifically a conservative idea is pull yourself up by the bootstraps. I got no boots. There's no infrastructure laid out for a person in that area to remove themselves from that impoverished life. And when you're working poor, at least you have the access to those things. There was nowhere in my neighborhood that was going to employ me. Most of those places were family-owned liquor stores or little convenience stores. No one was going to employ me in those places. What do you think is the most effective way to enact a real change in the communities like that? Like you said in the book that there's different examples. What programs would perhaps a person that was in my position be able to access to help make that change?
Well, there are a lot. So we talk about dozens of policies and strategies and just action, and there isn't one that solves everything, unfortunately. There isn't one silver bullet or one answer. But there's a lot of smaller, more incremental steps that make a big difference. So just to speak to your story for a minute, the how you described it was so astute and so well said to show how, when segregation, whether it's economic or racial segregation, and they often go hand in hand, once it's established, it doesn't undo itself, without intentional steps. So like you said, you grow up around people who are also poor and don't have prospects, and there's nothing in your neighborhood to help you, see a different future. When people who live in that kind of environment then move to an environment that's more integrated economically and racially, just having contact with people who have different prospects in their lives and have different expectations, it has been shown in studies that improves children's outcomes, even if their family remains low income. If they're in an integrated neighborhood where they have a network of people who are from various income levels, that has an influence on how their lives turn out. And so we have to take these intentional steps. So one example I can talk about, which I'm sure you have opinions about, and there's a lot to say, but as rental voucher programs like the Section 8 program or the Housing Choice Voucher program. So that's a federally funded program, underfunded. Only a quarter of the people who are eligible actually get a voucher. But, over 2 million households get vouchers in this country. They're disproportionately African-American households. And the voucher program was started with the intention to help those lower income families who live in high poverty neighborhoods to leave those neighborhoods if they want. So to move to these areas of higher opportunity and better resources, because the voucher is a mobile benefit. So unlike the public housing program, where when you get public housing, it's tied to a unit, a building in a neighborhood. When you get a voucher, the idea is you can use it to rent anywhere in the jurisdiction of your housing authority, because it helps subsidize you paying your rent to a private landlord. So it had the potential and the promise to allow for mobility for low-income families, so to get out of the cycle that you were describing. But it doesn't work that way. Only 5% of voucher holders actually can use their voucher to leave high poverty neighborhoods. And white voucher holders are far more likely to than African Americans. And there's a few reasons for that. Even though this is a federally funded program, it's administered locally, and there's a lot of sort of leverage on the local level that housing authorities and local communities have to make it a better tool for mobility. One is that, and I talk about this all the time, and it always baffles me. It's a federally funded program, and the federal government does not protect recipients of that program from discrimination. So it's legal in a lot of the country for landlords to just say, I won't rent to a Section 8 recipient. That kind of discrimination has been outlawed in cities and counties in some states, so about 20 states and 100 cities and counties. So that helps to open up access to voucher holders to, higher opportunity neighborhoods where otherwise they could just be discriminated against. So first step is passing one of those ordinances locally, and then ensuring that it's enforced, ensuring that landlords know that they can't discriminate, that tenants know when they're being discriminated against, and that there's some enforcement mechanism to, prosecute those landlords that continue to discriminate against Section 8 tenants. And then there's other aspects of the program. I can get into the sort of details of it, but, that is up to the local housing authority that can make a voucher. So how the voucher is usually calculated, the amount of your voucher, you take the household's income, no matter what it is. So even if they have a very low income, 30% of their monthly income is what that household can pay towards their rent, and then the voucher makes up the difference. But it makes up the difference up to a maximum rental amount. And that rental amount is usually set using the entire metropolitan area's, full span of rents, the lowest to the highest, finding the middle and going 10% below that middle or median rent. So that's the most a voucher will pay. So that, by definition, means that 60% of the rents in that metropolitan area are too expensive for voucher holders. They just can't afford it. It's beyond the means of their voucher. So 60% of the rents are more likely, the 60% highest rents are more likely to be in these areas of higher opportunity. So even though the program has this promise to provide the opportunity to move to those areas, they're blocked by the cost and the limits of their voucher. So some, to address this, some local areas are now being required to calculate that maximum voucher amount differently. So instead of using the median of the entire metropolitan area, they adjust it for higher cost areas versus lower cost areas. So in higher cost neighborhoods, the voucher will pay more towards rent than in lower cost areas. Some housing authorities are required to do that, and all others can do that voluntarily. So this is another thing we can advocate for locally to help make this program a better tool for mobility for low-income folks to move out of high-poverty neighborhoods if they want.
When you talk about the ability difference, even though class is the same, but race is different, I can speak to that. I constantly make people aware of the fact that I know the reason that I moved out of the situation that I lived in, and many of the people that I grew up with are still there, is because of white privilege. And that is that I was able to go to a Goodwill and purchase a pair of khakis for about $1.50 to $2. I had those khakis for about 10 years. But I was able to buy them. I was able to go to interviews outside of my neighborhood. I'd ride my bike to these neighborhoods far, far away, and I was able to do what I called the white voice, and that is I would not talk about my background. I would not discuss how I grew up, and I would, present as just another white person and in an interview, and that benefited in me being able to get jobs and eventually to get a job in a fast food establishment where I was a manager.
Mm.
I had a very strange interaction with a manager at that time because once I had the job, they kind of became aware of who I was. And it was hard to hide my background. And I remember distinctly my manager at the time, he said, "You have a funny accent." And I said, "Oh, do I?" He goes, "Hold on, just 1 second." And he closed his eyes and he said, "Keep talking." And I kept talking. And he said, "Yes, that's a black man standing right there."
Wow.
And I think that at that moment, I recognized something. I realized even being capable of getting the job, like I still wasn't white enough to keep the job. And it really did. It changed the way that I spoke. It changed. My accent now is completely different. I realized that if I wanted to have any upward movement in society, that I would have to conform to what they expected me to sound like. And even recently, we saw in the Trump versus Kamala Harris presidential race. Many people said when she was in, I think it was Atlanta or something, "Oh, she has a different accent." And I thought, wow, that's funny because so do I.
Right.
If you take me down to my neighborhood where I grew up, I speak a lot differently than this because that's where I'm comfortable. And that's how I actually speak. And, when you say, you take these vouchers outside and you experience this discrimination, we can talk a little about the covenants that were created during, a very bad time in America, which led to African Americans not being able to purchase the property that white people could because of what was considered legal discrimination. And it still exists to this day in the form of, certain HOAs and stuff. I think that the best thing, in my opinion, and I just want to get your opinion on this, is, it comes down to electing the correct people on the local level to, like you said, enforce these discrimination laws and to put in place discrimination laws that will help to regulate people that would choose not to rent to a black family, whereas they would rent to a white family with the same voucher. Do you agree with that?
So I do 100% agree with that. It's about electing the right people, and then showing up to the city council meetings, planning commission meetings, continuing to vote on the issues that are important to us and that define the segregation of our communities, because, having the right elected officials in office is essential, but then we also need to help them make the right decisions going forward. And they need to have their constituents showing that they support these efforts. And I'll add, these anti-discrimination ordinances, they are passed by local city councils or county boards of supervisors or state legislatures, but then it's often left up to fair housing centers to enforce those anti-discrimination ordinances. Cities and counties, they might have a commission or a agency that will take complaints, but they're not out there investigating discrimination to find out where it's happening. They're just receiving the complaints, and maybe they have an enforcement mechanism or maybe they don't. But fair housing organizations, nonprofit organizations do this work all the time. And so another thing we can do is support those organizations to do the anti-discrimination work in housing. And then how they do that is because when someone's discriminated against in renting a unit, say you're a Section 8 recipient or you're an African-American family and you try to rent a unit and you're told it's rented, you don't know if maybe the next person who's white who doesn't use the Section 8 is offered the unit. You don't know you're being discriminated against because you don't know how other people are being treated. You only know how you're being treated. So the only way to really identify where discrimination is happening, because it's often not, very blatant, is to do what's called paired testing, which is when fair housing organizations or civil rights organizations run these programs. They often get volunteers or sometimes pay people to do this. They pose as potential tenants or home buyers. They have, the same qualifications, but maybe different names, different sounding names, ethnically sounding names, or they're of different races, but otherwise have the same qualifications. Or if they're testing for Section 8 discrimination, one says they use Section 8 voucher and one says they don't. And if the people are treated differently, given the same income levels and the same qualifications, but they're treated differently, then that's how we can identify where discrimination is occurring.
Hmm.
So one way, aside from electing the right people to pass these ordinances and then enforce them, one way that we can individually contribute to these remedies is by volunteering with fair housing organizations to be testers.
And it's really funny. Fred Trump was actually caught in one of those mystery customer, is what I call them, mystery customer
Yeah.
nets,
Secret
and
shoppers. Yeah.
yeah, secret shoppers. Do you think that there's, because we talked a little bit about transportation, childcare is another thing, educational opportunities. These are all things that like really hold back also these communities, because obviously, as we all know, many school districts are their funding is determined by, as you said, the zip code and property taxes within them. And obviously, impoverished communities end up with homes that are not worth very much money. The property taxes then are what determines what the school funding gets, and therefore they end up with poor educational opportunities as well. Do you think there's something that we can do, or something that's in the book that talks about it, about how to like level that playing field? Is there something that we can change about what we do nowadays for those communities, whether it's social safety nets or something different? I myself wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for social safety nets. I grew up in California, and I pay my taxes willingly because, unlike a lot of other people, I know just how important it is to subsidize and help the impoverished communities. I would not be in the position I am today if it wasn't for social safety nets. Do you think
Yeah.
there's something that we can do that's better?
I think there's a lot that we can do. We very intentionally focused on local policy and just action. So taxation policy, universal basic income programs, social safety net policies are sort of beyond the scope of what we discussed in just action, but they're essential. We do mention that we need all of these, income support programs, social safety net, social services. I think universal basic income is where we should be going. But we just sort of mentioned that in just action because we really wanted to focus on what we could affect locally. Now, property taxes and how schools are funded is not up to local governments, but where we live and what neighborhoods where we choose to live is up to us. And, a lot of people with access to different neighborhoods with more wealth tend to be more white families who have access to intergenerational wealth, which we can get into the reasons for that. They, tend to choose neighborhoods based on school districts that they think are good based on test scores. Now, those test scores, we've been told, show, what the quality of the school is. But really, it's been proven that those test scores that are, they're metrics for a school actually measure how segregated or integrated a school is. And so when we're making decisions based on test scores, people with resources tend to stick to segregated white neighborhoods and schools, which then just further exacerbates and continues that cycle of segregation. So if we can sort of challenge our assumptions about what a good school is and what good education is, and start to understand that it's actually better for everyone to be educated in diverse environments. It's better for all students to learn how to, interact and work together with people of different races. They do better as workers in this economy. They, have better outcomes. And so if we choose instead schools and neighborhoods based on how integrated they are, then we start to break that pattern.
I want to go back to something you said about the wealth gap in a second, because
Mm-hmm.
I would like to talk to you about the Levitt communities and something
Mm-hmm.
that came as a realization today. But something you just said actually like strikes me as something that I deeply believe. I believe in the rising tide lifts all boats. I believe that we are better as a community of we, not a community of me. And I think that most people have a really hard time understanding exactly how much they would benefit from everyone doing better, how much the economy benefits when everyone is doing better. I think a lot of people don't understand the impact of poverty-stricken communities when it does come to crime, when it comes to use of emergency rooms and healthcare and the uninsured, and what that does overall to the economy. What would you say would be a good way to explain what the benefits the average everyday Americans that they would gain from reducing residential segregation?
Yeah, I like to answer this question in different ways because I think different people respond to different kinds of information.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some people who respond to, economic metrics. And like you said, our whole economy suffers because of segregation. There have been studies that show how much our country's GDP has been depressed because of residential segregation. So when people can't move to where their jobs, where they can be most productive and where their best job is because of exclusionary policies that maintain racial segregation, then our whole economy suffers. So that's one argument. We're all worse off in that way. We're also worse off when we don't know how to get along with people who look differently from us. The polarization in this country is extreme. It has tracked by race a lot more than it is today, but race plays a role in that. And our sort of siloed media and where we get our news, all of these efforts to kind of keep us living in a bubble where we're just surrounded by people who are like us, makes us unable to understand each other and leads to these like polarized times where, if we don't have social personal relationships with people of other races, we don't adopt and support policies that sort of that we consider to help other people, even though, most of those policies help all of us.
Yeah, and that's
So,
why diversity is so important. As a
right.
person that has managed for 20 plus years, I continually make this argument on my channel with people when people come in and complain about DEI. I say DEI isn't diversity of skin color, it's diversity of thought. And me, as a person who runs a business, I can tell you that when it's Pride Month, I'm probably not the guy that you should ask as far as like what is going to drive sales during that time. What do people want? What are they interested in? And when you have something like our government, people oftentimes a lot of the conspiracy minded will come in and say, they'll go, well, what about Operation Mockingbird? What about Paperclip? What about the Costa Contra? What about JFK? All these things. They go, if you know about these things in our government, which, there has been proven manipulation through our government of our citizenry, how could you possibly have any faith in this government? And I always say, you know what the funny thing is? You know what gives me faith in our government? Diversity. Because I see people like Cortez up there. Because I see gay men, gay women, because I see African Americans being represented. Because if you've ever seen a picture of the Cold War Congress, it is nothing but old white men, okay? And you can understand where this, the glue that holds them together is that all of them have the same goals in sight.
Right.
There's nothing different about any of these people. They're all wealthy white men with connections, status, and wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, their goals are all aligned.
Mhm.
But when we have diversity, when we have a person that, say, has come here with their family and their family immigrated here in their second or third generation, and now they're a politician, and somebody says, hey, we're going to start deporting people and we're not going to be checking, anything. We're just going to kick them out of the country. That person's going to stand up and go, well, hold on a second. My mother came here. My grandmother came here. And I'm a politician now, and I am a working, productive citizen in this society. And that's what diversity gains. And I like to do it the same way you just did it. I like to say to the people out there, hey, all you care about is money? Well, I'll tell you this. Target's not as successful as they are because Target just made money off of being white. They made it off of diversity. They made it off of pushing diversity. They made it off of bringing in people that were from diverse opinions. And then the other side of it is just what you just said there is you should also, if you're on the other side and you just want to see people doing well, these are all people who are Americans, regardless of sexuality, regardless of gender, regardless of ethnicity. If they're doing well, that means that you're going to do well. And so I greatly appreciate the way that you just explained that. To go back to the Levitt thing, I
Mhm.
made this realization today. So many times you hear somebody say, my mom bought this house in the 50s
Mhm.
for practically no money at all. She just sold it for $1.1 million. And you think, without any education on the subject, you go, wow, that's crazy that she had this like forethought or luck to be around at this time to purchase this home and now sell it for this much. Would you like to talk about the Levitt communities and what they were?
So, in the mid 20th century, we were a mostly urban economy. Most people lived, they worked in manufacturing or businesses that supported factories and had to live near those businesses, which were in urban areas near railroads and ports. Mostly, fairly integrated urban areas because those businesses and factories employed people of all races. And then we had a housing crisis after World War II. And there was a baby boom when millions of war veterans came home from the war. There hadn't been housing built during the war or the Great Depression before that. So there weren't enough houses, sort of like today. And so at that time, the federal government decided it wanted to step in and do something to meet the demand for housing. And what it did was help to subsidize the building of suburbs all over the country. So created suburbs. We weren't a suburban country. People didn't really live in suburbs. They didn't have the cars and, we didn't have the transportation systems. So to create these suburbs, the federal government subsidized builders like William Levitt. Now, he was only one of many, but he's a well known one. But it's a great example. But just want to be clear that, Levittown and the Levitt communities aren't the only places this happened. This happened all over the country, the West Coast, the East, the Northwest, all over. The federal government helped to subsidize developers to build these suburban communities by providing federally backed loan guarantees through the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration would only provide these loan guarantees to developers who agreed to not build their development anywhere near where African Americans lived, and then to put restrictive covenants on the deeds of the homes that they built, saying that the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. This was written into the federal manual, into federal policy. So created subsidized white communities. And those homes, like you said, they were affordable because they were subsidized by the federal government. They cost about, in Levittown in New York, about $100,000. In today's money, a home in a suburban community cost about $100,000. And white families, if they were veterans, could get a VA loan
Yep.
that had no down payment required. If they weren't veterans, they could get a Federal Housing Administration loan with low interest rates and low down payment requirements. So they were subsidized also to buy the homes. And then those homes, African Americans, explicitly prohibited. You can't buy these homes. It's written into the deed. You can't live here. You can't buy the home. And you can't get a mortgage to, on top of it. So those communities then, were white for a very long time. Those restrictive covenants became not legally enforceable at some point. We had the Fair Housing Act in 1968. You can't discriminate by race in the sale and rental of housing anymore. But that segregation and that disparity was already created. And so the white families who got affordable homes, and it's hard to imagine, but at the time, home ownership wasn't as common and it wasn't seen as, a ticket to wealth. It was just you needed a place to live. There was a home. You could get a mortgage for it. It was affordable. You lived there. But they did become a ticket to wealth. And those homes accumulated in value. Now in Levittown, the median home price is over $600,000. In a lot of suburban communities, they're over $1 million. So those white families built up that wealth through the, increased value of their home that they could then use to send their kids to college or to enjoy their retirements or to help their kids and grandkids buy their own homes. And African Americans were explicitly prohibited from building up wealth in the same way. So then, when the Fair Housing Act came along and it was like, okay, now you can buy a home in Levittown, but, good luck when you don't have, generations of wealth built up to be able to afford that home because those homes are no longer affordable to working families. So that's how, even when the policies that establish segregation have changed, the consequences they compound over time. So the wealth gap between blacks and whites has been huge and getting bigger since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And the gap in home ownership rates between African Americans and whites is also bigger than it was when the Fair Housing Act passed. So these forward-looking policies, while essential and important to, outlaw discrimination going forward, without addressing the disparities that exist already from past policies, we don't actually, fix it.
Mm-hmm. And another crazy stat from that period is it's something like you mentioned the GI Bills and the no down payment. It's something like 98% of all of those people that applied and were given the ability to use that grant were white.
Yeah.
Only 2% were African Americans.
Yeah, it's such a small, it's like a number that, like a handful.
yeah, it's absolutely insane.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to speak a little bit about what's going on today, and my analogy of the person that buys the house and then they sell it for $1 million, it just doesn't go through your head, right? Like that, oh, these people are benefiting from something that was done as a horrific act to African Americans 60, 70 years ago. And it doesn't go through your head because of course you're not applying that as this person has done something racist, but it's racism that accrued that wealth for those people. And I just had that thought today and I was like, wow, that's to think that when people talk about systemic racism, a lot of people don't understand what that means. They don't, it's not, the guy your manager is this guy who hates black people. It's that the system itself, because of the laws, as you just explained, it can't be fixed over just a small amount of time or with one or two new laws. I think Biden had 2 executive actions that he did during his presidency to try to make it more fair. But 2 is it's a drop in the bucket compared to all of the legislation that has come before it. So speaking on that, we now have obviously an administration in Trump's administration with the real president Elon Musk, that are rolling back discrimination laws and are, getting rid of a lot of the things that communities like this are subsidized by. That even if they haven't benefited from it as much as say me or you would like them to have, at least it was an opportunity for them. What do you think? Do you think that the book, what it suggests to people, do you think that it changes with this new administration?
I don't think the general premise of the book changes at all. I think it's actually even strengthened by what's happening because we focused on local policy because when we wrote the book in 2020, there wasn't appetite or political will on the federal level to take these steps. And now, even more so, there's not. And so we focused where people can actually have an impact and where policies that can have an impact on segregation and on these disparities can be passed and where they can be effective. And that is still the case, that we can adopt and advocate for these policies and strategies locally in our own cities and counties and states. And it's just as true, if not more true, given what's happening on the federal level. Now, we're a few weeks in, a month almost, and
Is that
Who
it?
knows? Or several years, it's hard to tell. Um, who knows what's coming next,
Mm-hmm.
but from where it looks right now, a lot of what we talked about in Just Action is still possible, still being pursued in many communities. A lot of advocates and local elected officials aren't backing down from these efforts. We don't know how bad it's going to get, but for now, I think we can't stop pushing forward on these issues, just because of what's happening nationally, when we do have some opportunity locally to do something about it.
That's a good answer because, I just spoke to Stephen Robinson, who's another author who wrote a book about challenging Trump and the state of New York. Trump wanted to purchase a portion of land along, I think it was the Manhattan River. And they challenged it because it would have gentrified the area and it would have ruined the culture. It would have made a lot of poorer or lower middle class people. It would have made them homeless. And his whole premise was based on local action, getting involved on a local level and challenging the state. And many times during the conversation, he said it wasn't about fighting Trump, it was about fighting the state of New York. And as long as we continue to focus on that and not on Trump, that's how we had success. And they did successfully stop him from purchasing that land. In fact, they did in fact allow that to be made into something that the city took advantage of and was helpful to the community. So
Great.
I love that answer. It's get involved on a local level. I tell people all the time, you start to overextend at some points and you worry so much about these bigger problems. And what you really need to do is lead by example. You need to
Yeah.
mind your bubble. You need to affect the people around you. And you need to show that the things that you do lead to positive results. So that way they also want to do the things that you do. And
Yeah.
so that's a great answer. My favorite question, I think, to ask everybody when it comes to authors in these books is generally, what is like the most important thing that you learned from writing these books? And even more important here, I think, what do you think was the most important thing that you learned from co-authoring this book with your father?
Well, it's interesting to answer that question now in 2025, but I was hesitant to join my dad to write this book when he first asked me or posed the idea, because I wasn't sure I wasn't sure how to answer the question, what do we do about it? And that we would find enough answers and enough examples of people taking action to advance racial equity. This was 2020, um, you know, the first Trump time around. And so in writing the book and researching it, I actually came out feeling a lot more hopeful than I did going in. I found so many examples of communities working on these issues, surprising examples to me. And since the hardcover came out in 2023, the paperback is coming out March 4th. But since it's been out, I've been traveling around the country speaking to groups, all kinds of groups in all regions of the country. And I've been really emboldened and given a lot of hope from all of these communities that are taking action. And some, in the face of a lot more opposition than, I face in California. Some, states are sort of blocking them every step of the way, and still these advocates are continuing to fight for housing equity and housing access and reducing racial disparities. And so that has been my greatest learning from writing the book, is that paying attention to what's happening on the local level is actually more helpful than just paying attention to what happens on the national level, because that can just leave you feeling deflated. But we don't hear about what's happening in the small community, in the Midwest when we're on the West Coast. But if we can hear about that, we learn that there's actually people like us all over the country taking actions together to advance these goals, and that can help us sort of have the courage and motivation to do it ourselves.
Nice. And I say this to all the authors that come on here. The work that you do is incredibly important.
Mm.
We live in a day and age that I refer to people as being overstimulated and undereducated. I think that we live in a world where people get all of their information from short form videos and from memes and do not spend enough time actually researching the subject. And just my engagement with you, my engagement with the subject, as I said at the start of this podcast, helped to fill a hole, which I don't think I would have ever recognized, to be honest with you. I don't think if it was just a conversation and you were to say to me, if I were to say racism is this or racism is bad because of this, and you were to say, yeah, and the things that are going on with housing are insane, I'd probably go, I don't even know what that means, and probably move on.
Mm.
So the work that you do, and I watched some of your dad's speeches. I love them. I think he's very well spoken. I think he's doing something for other people that is incredibly important. And so I just want to say thank you to you and to your father for writing the book. And I don't know how many people out there still read anymore. But obviously enough to buy millions of your dad's books, so that's
Yeah.
good. And I still read a lot, and I think that that's one of the most important things in our society to not let loose, not to let go of, is that long form content, conversations like these, reading books, and just caring about people that aren't yourself.
Yeah.
Very important to this society.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me and for all of the work you do to expand people's awareness and knowledge.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and hit that notification bell, and check out that video on the screen now.